Welcome to Matt Easton's Movie and TV Weapon Review. So let's take a look at Wonder Woman's sword. Now, straight off, this is not as simple as it may seem, because in fact, in the movies, she's been represented with two different swords. The sword that she first appeared, at least on the screen in Batman vs Superman, was not the same sword that she's featured in Wonder Woman with. But of course, chronologically, if we imagine this is real history, Wonder Woman happened first. Now, far be it from me to give any spoilers, but there is a reason that she can't use the sword that she appears in Wonder Woman with in the later film. I will leave viewers to discover that for themselves. But quite simply, she must have acquired a new sword prior to the historical, shall we say, episodes or events of Batman vs Superman. They are similar-ish swords, they're similar types of swords, but they are definitely not the same sword. It's also worth noting at this point that the shield that she carries in Batman vs Superman is also a different design to the one shown in Wonder Woman. We don't know why this would be, but it could simply be the fact that they use different props for the different films. But if we want to make this into an expanded universe kind of logic loop, then potentially something happened to her shield, or she has more than one shield. We simply don't know at this stage. Now, in terms of the actual sword used in Wonder Woman, which is what I'm going to be focusing on here because it features the most detail and we can say the most about it, unlike the sword shown in Batman vs Superman, which we're really not given much information about at all. The sword shown in Wonder Woman is known as Godkiller. Now, it's clear that this sword is, generally speaking, supposed to be inspired, much like the rest of the aesthetics of Wonder Woman's world and the island that she lives on, is supposed to be inspired by ancient Greece. So first up, what can we actually say about the sword? Well, it's very clear that it's super strong because Wonder Woman is super strong herself, and she does things and has effects on materials around her, including armoured vehicles and buildings. And I won't spoiler anyone who hasn't seen the film yet. I do recommend it, it's a great film. But she has effects on physical materials such as rock and steel and bronze that are superhuman, to put it simply. Now, it's quite clear that if she used a normal sword, she would almost certainly break it in use. Just the simple blows that she would give, or the type of things that she does with her sword, a normal sword simply wouldn't be able to stand up to that type of abuse from that super strength. Therefore, we can conclude that by necessity she has to be using a sword which is, shall we say, superhuman strong, or super sword strong. Obviously there's some mythology built around the sword, and this is featured in the movie. I won't go into the details of that, but it's very clear that this is not a normal sword. It's also worth noting as well that given that she's supposed to be from ancient Greece, she should probably be using a bronze sword, but the Godkiller sword is clearly not bronze. It's not the right colour. It is in fact the colour of steel. Now, indeed, they were using iron swords in the later Greek era, so we could excuse that and we could say that it's some type of steel, some type of meteoric iron perhaps. Really, we don't need to think too hard about this because it is supposed to be a super strong sword, and I think that's really where the focus should remain, is that we don't need to understand what it's made of or how it was made. All we need to know is that the end result is far stronger than a normal bronze or iron or steel blade. Now, what about the actual physical characteristics of the sword? Well, fundamentally, it's a short sword, but it's not that short. It's certainly a lot bigger than most ancient Greek or, for example, hoplite Spartan swords would be. It looks to me to be about 50% larger. I don't know the exact measurements of the sword used in the movie, but looking at it in comparison to the size of the actors and the other objects around in the scenes, it seems clear to me that it's a fairly large sword. It's not as large as a typical medieval arming sword would be, but it's certainly bigger than most ancient Greek or indeed Roman era swords would be. It's larger than your average gladius, and it's larger than your average hoplite sword. We could also say that the shape of the blade is not exactly typical. Something that we do see certainly in the Bronze Age era and carrying over into the Iron Age is a slightly leaf-shaped blade. These leaf-shaped blades are an amazing design, and really in some ways, to students of swords and weapons, it is quite surprising that leaf-shaped blades didn't continue further down through history. In fact, they were used all over Europe, and they were used in India and various other parts of the world. And the advantage of a leaf-shaped blade is it gives you a lot of cutting capacity at what we call the centre of percussion. The centre of percussion is the portion of the blade about 3/4 of the way up from the hilt or from the guard, which you cut with, and that is the portion of the blade which exerts the most force or energy on the target and has the most effect. Therefore, if you make the blade wider at that point, you're increasing the mass at the hitting portion of the blade, the centre of percussion, and you're making it more easy to make an edge geometry which is more conducive to effective cutting. Coupled with this, by having the broad section of the blade down at the centre of percussion and then having it tapering to a point, you're making it a very effective thrusting sword as well. And that's why this basic style of blade with an almost flaring cutting portion and then a very tapered stabbing portion at the tip was popular in antiquity. It was popular in the Bronze Age, and for example on the Ewart Park swords it was carried right the way through Bronze Age Europe, used by the Celts and every other civilization really in Bronze Age Europe, and then it was carried over into Iron Age designs, and in fact we still see it in the Roman era in the Mainz Gladius. The Mainz Gladius combines these features of very effective cutting and thrusting. But what we must note is the Mainz Gladius, or indeed any of these Bronze Age swords with leaf blades, are smaller than Wonder Woman's sword. It does make you wonder if the sword that they made for Wonder Woman would have been too unwieldy, too heavy in the tip, if they'd made it as large as it is with a leaf-shaped blade. But whatever the reason, they've decided to go with more or less straight edges, and the end result is a blade which is not unlike a very large Gladius, perhaps more like the Pompey era Gladius rather than the Mainz Gladius, but nevertheless it is somewhat like a very large Gladius. But I must reiterate, it is much larger than Gladiuses were, and Gladii even, and it is quite a large sword for antiquity. It was very rare to find swords in antiquity that were this large, because the materials that they were working with were, generally speaking, until the late or mid or late Roman era, were probably not reliable enough or trusted enough to be made into very large blades. Now let's pay a little bit of attention to the hilt. There are a few things to note about the hilt, and I have to say, as someone who has collected swords for over 20 years and teaches historical fencing and teaches martial arts with weapons on a weekly basis, there are a few things about this hilt that instantly make me go, blech. Quite simply, it is made up of 3 parts. There is the pommel, that is the end piece of the grip, if you want to call it that, or the hilt. There is the handle, obviously the part that you hold, and then there is the guard, which is the part between the handle and the blade. Let's look at the pommel first. Well, the pommel's not too bad. It's this weird kind of almost like split ram's horn kind of design. It does make you, if it's make you wonder if they're alluding to Ares there or something, but this kind of split forked design is not very ergonomic, although it has to be said, the way that it flares out is not going to harm the hands. If the hand is slid down to that point at the end of the grip, then indeed I suppose it would probably be fairly comfortable. But as a pommel essentially fulfills 2 main criteria. One, it stops your hand sliding off the grip, and secondly, it provides some degree of counterbalance to the rest of the weapon. Now, some people argue about this. It is in fact true that there are types of sword which don't really have pommels that counterbalance the blade at all. In other words, their pommels are either hollow or small or flat, or they just don't have much mass to them and don't provide much counterbalancing effect. However, you do notice that swords which don't have pommels very often have long grips, and the long grip itself is the counterbalance, is the pommel essentially. So if you look at something like a Japanese katana or a Thai krabi or a da, for example, if you look at these types of swords which have long grips but which often are used one-handed, when you're holding them one-handed, that long grip becomes the pommel, it becomes the counterbalance. But back to Wonder Woman's pommel. It is a bit odd looking, and I've got to say aesthetically I don't really like it. I don't think it looks like it balances the sword visually. I think they should have made something which is a little bit more blocky, maybe more round. it just doesn't look very aesthetically pleasing to me. But in terms of function, I suppose it would perform its function in conjunction particularly with this long grip. Now let's talk about the grip. So the grip is really one of the things that I find most strange about this sword. This sword is clearly a short or shortish sword that's intended to be used with shields, as was completely normal in ancient Greece. It was almost unheard of to use swords without shields. Think of them more like large knives or daggers rather than how we think of a sword being used by itself to duel. They simply weren't used like that. Even in the Roman era there is very, very little evidence, unlike as you may see in a film like Gladiator for example, but there is very little evidence for swords being used by themselves. They were always intended to be used alongside a shield. So given that it's assumed to be used with a shield and supposed to be used with a shield, why does it have such a long grip? This is what most swordsmen would recognise as a two-handed grip. It's exceptionally long for the size and type of the sword, and it just looks, frankly, odd. If we look at Bronze Age swords or Roman gladius or hoplite swords, then they're all short-gripped. If you have a one-handed sword, it is more handy, it's more convenient to have a one-handed length grip. There's simply no purpose to having a grip longer than that, other than to perform counterbalance. And it's funny because there's a sort of circular logic in the design of this sword, because the really kind of rubbish pommel that they've given it actually does go with the long grip, because the long grip acts as the counterbalance. So in a sense you could say, well, the grip makes sense because of the pommel, and the pommel makes sense because of the grip. Well, whatever. I think it's kind of a circular logic that only makes sense within itself, but to me, for an ancient era sword, they should have given this a short one-handed grip and a slightly larger pommel. But there is a bigger problem with the grip of this sword, and it's, to me, quite a fundamental one. It appears to be circular in cross-section. The problem with a circular grip on the cross-section of a sword grip is that it turns in your hand. If you ever watch a show like Forged in Fire, they're forever talking about indexing weapons. What that means is when you pick the weapon up, without looking at it, you should know which direction your edge or edges are pointing in. If you can't feel that in your hand, it means you have to look, you have to check, and it also means in the middle of a fight, the sword could get turned slightly in your hand, and when you hit someone, you don't cut, you just hit them with the flat of the sword, and that's no good at all. Swords aren't good bludgeoning weapons. They're not light, they don't have an awful lot of impact. They work by cutting, and you can only cut with good edge alignment. The problem with circular grips is, without a curved blade which helps you feel the edge alignment, when you've got a straight blade, the sword can turn in your hand and you don't even know it's turned in your hand. So, to my mind, it's a design flaw, much like the sword featured in Blade, incidentally, that it's got a completely cylindrical grip. No good at all. Now let's look at the guard. So the guard of this sword, to my mind, in overall shape, seems to be inspired by Bronze Age swords. Now Bronze Age swords do often have a guard which is shaped in this approximate form, and what's interesting is the reason they're this shape is not for defensive purposes, it's actually because it used to be the connecting junction between the blade and the hilt. So originally bronze swords were made of two parts. They were made of a bronze hilt and a bronze blade, and the bronze blade, believe it or not, was riveted to the bronze hilt. Now quite early on in the Bronze Age they found that this was a fairly weak manner of attaching a blade to a hilt, and we actually find archaeological examples of these swords where the rivets have torn and sheared out of the guard and the blade has come away. So quite clearly where someone has hit with the sword, that junction has come under too much strain and is just broken. But what's interesting is later when they devised more strong ways of attaching the blade and the hilt, or indeed making them out of one piece of bronze, they kept the basic shape and design of the guard, almost certainly just because of tradition. And in fact we can say this with some certainty because they even retain the vestigial rivets, so the little heads of the rivets, but they're not actual rivets, they're just become decoration. And if you only knew about those little decorative knobs or rivet heads, you'd wonder why they were there. But because archaeologists can show us the earlier examples of the sword, where the rivets are connection points, we understand that. So we could say with this sword, the reason the guard is this overall shape is because of something to do with the evolution of swords. We could say that in an earlier form of sword, in the Amazonian culture, this type of guard was devised for some specific purpose that we now no longer know. Now, is it a useful guard for defence? Well, no, not really. But that's not really a problem if you're using a shield. One of the things that's conspicuous about sword and shield use is that when you've got a shield, you don't need a big handguard, because the shield tends to protect the line to your hand, to your sword hand, and seems to protect the arm very well. So in fact you don't need a big guard if you're using the sword with a shield. This is almost certainly one of the reasons why we start to see in the Renaissance complex guards start to appear as shields start being used less. But I do have one other issue with this guard. It's incredibly blocky. So conversely, I thought that they should make the pommel more blocky to make the sword look more balanced, but instead they've made the guard incredibly blocky. Now if that's solid bronze or brass or whatever metal it is, that is going to be exceptionally heavy at a point of the blade where it serves no purpose whatsoever. Weight at the pommel end serves to balance the sword. Weight at the hitting end serves to make the sword hit harder and cut more effectively. But weight right in the middle of the sword serves absolutely no purpose at all. And that's why for centuries and millennia, sword designs have sought to make the guard section, or the centre of the sword, as light as possible. And when you make the guard heavier, you have to change the other properties of the sword to counter-effect that. So overall, what do I think of Wonder Woman's sword? Well, it may sound like I've really crapped on it and I don't like it, but you know what? I think it's not too bad. Within the confines of fantasy and superhero weapons, there are a lot worse out there, and I'll be looking at those in some future videos. But Wonder Woman's sword is okay. I just feel that they almost got something that looked right for an Amazonian warrior, but they kind of fell down on a few details, and I really wish that someone like me or someone else who really knows about ancient weapons had had a chance to tweak this design. I actually think the blade by itself, pretty damn good. Got no real issues with the blade. It's a bit big for the era, but so what? The guard to me is just ugly and too fat and too big, and it makes the sword look unbalanced in the middle. But the real fall down points for me are the grip and the pommel. The grip is way too long. Why is it that long? I don't think we ever see her use it two-handed, so why is it a two-handed grip? It's always used with a shield. It should have a short grip. But the pommel is just ugly. It really ruins the look of the sword. If this sword simply had a different pommel, pretty much any pommel, it would be better looking. And I think it's a really weak and light and unbalanced looking end to the sword. So there we go. I think fundamentally not a bad sword, but they fell down on some details. And I would really have liked to see something that in silhouette is a little bit closer to, say, for example, hoplite swords of the period. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.